thanks, Finn, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to our monthly UK Freshwater Quality Research Programme webinar series. I know many of you have joined these before, but for those new to the series, this webinar series is part of a NERC and DEFRA funded research programme on UK freshwater quality. It has a number of objectives which are written here on the slide, but it's really all about understanding the sources and behaviour of pollutants within our river systems and how they impact the freshwater ecosystem. And in particular, we're looking at mixtures of pollutants, emerging contaminants, and also looking at the interplay of these pollutants with changing hydrology related to land use change and climate change. And really part of the series is to bring together academics and stakeholders with an interest in the outputs from these research. And this is what we've been doing as part of the webinar series. So welcome everyone. The programme is made up of 5 projects. Again, Finn has outlined them here on this slide. And together, they're overseeing the 5 projects is the champion team, which is based at Water at Leeds, the University of Leeds. And then, as well as hearing from the projects, we're hearing from other research projects on freshwater quality. And really, if you want to get in contact with us, there's an email address. We've got a website. We're on X. And I'll hand over to our speaker today. Oh, no, I should say, if we're going back this one, our upcoming. So we're going to hear from Alison Dunn in a minute, but just to give you a reminder that we've already got our next 2 webinars planned. In December, we'll be hearing about Water Systems Integrated Modelling Framework by Dr. Barnaby Dobson from Imperial College. And then next year, we'll be returning to the 5 projects. We've heard from them once where they introduced the projects, but now we'll be hearing a little bit more of an update from the researchers, and we'll be starting in January, going back to EcoMix, which is based at the University of York, and we'll be hearing from Martha, who's based at York, and Amy, who's based at Sheffield. But today's webinar is given to us by Professor Alison Dunn, who's also from the University of Leeds, and she's going to be talking about invasive species. So I'll hand over to you, Alison.
So I've been talking a lot to Finn and the team over many years now about the importance of invasive non-native species in water, in freshwater networks, and how invasive species, both on their own and in interaction with lots of other pressures, can impact the quality of freshwaters. So I'm going to talk to you a bit by introducing invasive species. I want to talk a bit about the impact they can have in freshwaters. I'm confident that a lot of the people in the audience will recognize some of the species I'll talk about. And then I want to use that to talk a bit about how that can affect water quality, how it can affect water quality assessment, before moving on to look about strategies that we can do to try and reduce the impact of invasive species, focusing really particularly on biosecurity to slow the spread of these problematic invasive species. So I know that a lot of people are very engaged with ongoing management for invasive species. What I want to do is focus in particular about their prevention of either their introduction or their spread to new water bodies. So an invasive non-native species, or INNS, that terminology in the UK, which is used by the UK government, by DEFRA, by the Non-Native Species Secretariat, is synonymous with the EU definition invasive alien species. And it refers to any non-native animal or plant that's been introduced into an area that's not natural habitat, has the ability to spread, and can cause damage either to the environment, can cause economic damage, can affect human health and the way we live. An invasive species in the UK, there's probably over 20,000, but only 10 to 15% actually have this impact. There's loads and loads of non-native species that have been introduced, many, for example, plants in our garden, but a subset of 10 to 15% of those go on to have that invasive impact. They can spread and they can have environmental or economic impact. And interestingly, once you get to freshwater systems, they're disproportionately affected. They have a higher frequency of invasive species, but also, rather than 10 to 15%, about 40% of non-native species introduced to freshwaters go on to have a negative impact. The Environment Agency estimates that more than 70% of water bodies in England are at risk of deterioration because of invasive non-native species, with lakes being rated at 85% and rivers at 71%. So a very high percentage, more than half our water bodies, are at risk of deterioration because of the presence of these invasive non-native species and because of their impacts, either on native species or their direct structural impact or their impact on ecosystem functions. When we look at the Water Framework Directive, DEFRA produced this list of the top pressures affecting water bodies in England. They don't add up because many water bodies are affected by more than one pressure. But what's interesting is that invasive non-native species are up there. We start off with physical modification and then pollution, but the next thing in the list is invasive non-native species. So they're one of the top pressures affecting water bodies in England, affecting our water quality. And because of their impact, a subset of invasive non-native species have been called UK tag species, high impact species. Those high impact species, if they're present in a water body, will actually be a reason for not achieving good in the Water Framework Directive assessment. So this graph here from the Water Framework Directive from the Environment Agency shows the percentage of all water bodies in England that are affected by invasive non-native species. And in summary, 29% of those water bodies that are not rated good, that are rated less than good, are affected by invasive non-native species. So they're a clear problem in affecting our water quality and our ability to have our rivers quantified as being determined as being of good status. So as I say, there's lots and lots of non-native species. The following species have been identified as species in the Water Framework Directive that will affect a reason for not achieving good. And these are the aquatic species. So if you look at this table, the top bunch on a blue background in blue writing, these are all aquatic animals. Some of these are freshwater mollusks like the Asiatic clam. We've got our killer shrimp and our demon shrimp. That's those Dicogamruses up the top. And then we've got our mussels that clog up water pipes and so on. Got our mysid crustaceans. And then we've got our crayfish and mitten crab that threaten native diversity, but also cause burrowing in riverbanks and destabilize them. And then we've got a series of fish that are big, strong predators on native fish and displace them. The next ones of species are also aquatic species living in the water. And these are aquatic plants, such as water ferns, Crassula, Australian swamp stonecrop, I can't say it, which is a big problem in Yorkshire. Floating pennywort, which is actually largely not present in Yorkshire. We've got a good system of very rapidly trying to respond to small outbreaks, but in the south of England, it's a really big problem. In Thames, for example, it costs tens of thousands a year to manage it. So we've got a range of different invasive non-native plant species there. And then the species in grey at the bottom are also plant species, but they are riparian species. So they're found along riverbanks, things such as Japanese knotweed, which is well known to interfere with construction and building. And unfortunately, its spread is also associated with that. Gunnera, giant hogweed, which causes damages to human health, and Himalayan balsam that spreads along riverbanks. So there's a whole range of different species that are important for aquatic water quality. Just to go through a few of these as examples, floating pennywort. Floating pennywort can grow 15, 20 centimetres. in a week. It can grow massively quickly, and so it's spread across the surface of the water. When it does so, it blocks light penetration, which stops the growth of native plants, which then in turn doesn't provide food for the insects that eat them, and the fish that eat the insects, or the fish that graze on the plants, and so on. So it's got a biodiversity impact as well as an economic impact, because it can interfere with fishing equipment, it can interfere with boating equipment and navigation, and big mats of it can break off and clog things such as filters in water systems and contribute to flooding. So it can exacerbate flooding. That's floating pennywort. Here's a very different example, the signal crayfish, which was actually introduced deliberately to the UK and Europe as a food source, but unfortunately it's a strong competitor against native crayfish, to which it also spreads disease, which is largely why the native crayfish is going extinct, because of the spread of the signal crayfish and the disease it carries. The signal crayfish doesn't get sick. The native white-clawed crayfish, which is classed as endangered by the IUCN, gets sick and always dies as a result of this crayfish plague. And this little graph here just shows spread of signal crayfish. It's quite an old graph from 2002 to 2010, and it's clearly spread even further. So areas in the north of England, there are still populations of native crayfish, but the signal crayfish is spreading massively. Although initially it was deliberately introduced, it can be accidentally spread through lots of human activities. The other problem caused by signal crayfish is that it's a burrowing species. It forms burrows in riverbanks. It also likes to hide out in things like roots, etc. But the burrowing activity in particular can destabilize whole sections of riverbanks, because you get masses and masses of burrows in riverbanks. And it can also mobilize sediment with a big impact on water quality. So we've got both a biodiversity impact here and a sedimentation impact and a stability of banks impact. Zebra and quagga mussels are very important economically. So this is pictures of zebra mussels, and actually on the bottom left, this is a native pearl mussel, and it's encrusted with those tiny little zebra mussels that block its filter feeding and eventually might cause it to die. And then on the right is a water gauge that's encrusted entirely with zebra mussels. They like to attach to hard surfaces, and that can include things such as the inside of water pipes. So if you've got a water pipe with a lumen like this, give it a couple of years and the zebra mussels have restricted it. So they can prevent drainage, they can interfere with water supplies. They're a big problem in power stations. They're a big problem in water treatment works and so on. Interestingly, they also have motile larvae. So whilst we're looking at these encrusting zebra mussels, in the summer season, there's a risk of them being moved around from watercourse to watercourse through these motile larvae. Japanese knotweed. Apparently, the area of the UK affected by Japanese knotweed is larger than Cambridgeshire. So huge spread of Japanese knotweed, and it has the ability to grow up through very hard surfaces and interfere with construction and roads and so on, and damage buildings. So much so that actually it's now difficult to get a mortgage if a property is infested with knotweed, and any planning application have got to involve dealing with it, which is actually very difficult. If you've got knotweed and you pull it out and throw it on your compost heap, then I'm afraid that what you've then got is the knotweed will grow back unless you've dug very, very deeply to remove and destroy all the roots, and you get a new infestation in your compost heap, because it'll spring back from little bits of root or stem fragments. So disposal of knotweed is also a problem if you've got an infestation. And it can stop you getting mortgages, and it's an offence to allow it to spread off your land. And then the final sort of example of impacts that invasive species can have is those on human health. So on the right-hand picture here is Olaf Boy, who works for DEFRA and the Non-Native Species Secretariat, and he's about 6 foot tall. So giant hogweed gets really, really tall. This is a whole load of hogweed behind him, and then a dead stem with flower heads that he's holding onto there. So it gets very big, and unfortunately that looks like a very appealing plant to play with. But the sap is toxic, and it causes irritation and burns to the skin. Unfortunately, it's also phytoactive, so if you've been burnt by it, that burn can recur following exposure of your skin to sunlight for years and years after the initial injury. So it's a very unpleasant thing, and it can obviously imagine what happens if a dog gets it in its mouth or something like that as well. So a big health implication, and it can spread rapidly along riverbanks. And when it sets seed, those seeds can carry on, germinate for, at least 8 years afterwards. Some papers say 10, 15 years. So pulling it out is a very ongoing thing because it will keep growing back and growing back from that seed bank. So invasive non-native species can cause damage to our water quality. It can have environmental damage, for example, affecting biodiversity or affecting ecosystem function, for example, through sedimentation. It can have economic impact through flooding, sedimentation, clogging of equipment and so on, and can damage human health and the way we live. And cost estimates, the latest cost estimate that I saw was actually 2 billion a year to the UK, but then apparently there's still people debating about that. So the figure that the government's still using is 1.7 billion per year. But anyway, a very large cost. And a lot of that cost goes towards trying to deal with established invasive species. And that's when I want to start talking about why biosecurity to slow the spread of invasive species is really our first line of defense to defend our water quality, to defend freshwaters from the spread of invasive species. Even if something's present in the country, it may be in one river or watercourse or one water basin, but absent from others. And if we can prevent or slow that spread, we can try and guard against those environmental and economic and water quality costs. So this graph here from the Environmental Audit Committee's inquiry in 2019 that we gave advice to shows species costs of invasive species, control costs against the time after invasion. And what it shows quite nicely is that costs to try and prevent the introduction and establishment of invasive species are much lower than those costs of trying to undergo long-term management once something's become established. And particularly that we don't see any decline in that curve at the end, because largely speaking, once something's established, it's very, very difficult to get rid of it entirely. So you're often looking at year-on-year costs, which is why trying to target prevention of the introduction or secondary spread of invasive species is really important to try and improve our water quality across greater areas of the UK. If we think about a biological invasion, we can think about it having a series of stages or a series of processes. So initially, invasive non-native species can get moved around. Now, in this particular example, I've shown something being moved around by fouling a boat hull, but we can accidentally move stuff around on our clothing if we go out recreationally, or accidentally move it around on vehicles, or some stuff might be ornamental plants that have been released, or perhaps deliberate releases of things without people understanding the consequences and so on. So something might be introduced to a new area. After that, a subset of those might end up in the kind of area where the biological environmental conditions are such that it can establish and start to breed. And from there, the scene is set for wider spread to other populations. And hence we've got an invasive species impacting these various populations. Now, what determines whether something is introduced to a new environment is 99% human activity. Most of the spread of invasive species is to do with human actions. There is some natural spread, for example, stuff being moved around by animals or in water flow, but it's a very small proportion. We are the main component of spread, which is why invasive species are gaining on us year on year. And we can think about us being important in the introduction of species, for example, to a country or to a river, but also, if you look at the right-hand end of this, being important for secondary spread. So whilst we might have a particular invasive species, for example, we have signal crayfish in some rivers in Yorkshire, but not in all higher level watercourses, and biosecurity can prevent their spread and defend the native crayfish in the higher reaches of certain rivers. And this is where biosecurity is really important. Biosecurity talks about that first line of defense to try and prevent the introduction and spread of invasive non-native species. Let's look at that left-hand side of the graph here, trying to stop stuff perhaps coming into the country but also stopping anything being spread inadvertently or indeed deliberately between watercourses, because the main route by which this happens, unfortunately, is through human activity. So biosecurity is something that we're all familiar with in the context of diseases. We all have done some biosecurity this morning when we washed our hands before we had breakfast, for example. So biosecurity is any action that reduces the chance of spreading a harmful organism. It might be the spread of disease. In the case of invasive species, it's any action that reduces the chances of spreading an invasive species. And it can be as simple as cleaning potential invaders off your clothing, using water or picking off plant seeds, or if it's disease, using disinfectants. And one of the nice things about biosecurity is it doesn't require a lot of knowledge and ability to identify invasive species if it just becomes a routine part of our day-to-day working lives. And it's central, in fact, to policy for invasive species and disease control in the UK and the EU. The Non-Native Species Secretariat strategy is to reduce and prevent the intentional and unintentional introduction of INNS. That's the first line of defence, after which we go on to trying to control established populations. Similarly, the EU IAS legislation, which was translated into UK law a couple of years ago. And that's because invasive non-native species can accidentally be spread by a whole range of human activities, including things such as transport, trade, recreation, environment management, research, field work. General day-to-day activities that take us out into the natural environment can inadvertently spread what we might term a propagule. A propagule is the starting, the founder population of a new population of invasive species. So, for example, in this middle picture here, we've got Anita with some plant seeds attached to her fleece. They might accidentally get moved into a new area of woodland. On the left-hand side is a wader from one of my PhD students, actually covered in invasive killer shrimp. And female killer shrimp brood their eggs in a little brood pouch called a marsupium down their front. There could be 80 eggs in a single female, which go on to form a new population. And then things like plant diseases can be spread in soil, etc., on people's boots, shown on the right. And so biosecurity is anything we do to try and reduce this likelihood. As well as clothing, invasive species can spread by vehicles, equipment and clothing, anything that can be contaminated and accidentally move stuff around. So, for example, vehicles can get contaminated with invasive weeds or plants or seeds, etc. Recreational activities in freshwaters such as angling or kayaking or all sorts of different recreational activities can inadvertently move species around, as indeed even can environmental management such as weed control in itself. And just to give a little illustration, we did some surveys of some anglers and kayakers in the UK quite a while ago now, and asked them where they went with their kayaks or where they went angling. And these graphs are just a visual illustration. And we asked 4 million anglers on the left and 500,000 kayakers on the right, where they last used their kit and where they used it this week. So just where they went within the last 7 days. And you can see that lots of them are going very long distances and therefore moving their equipment between catchments. Now, if that kit's not got any invasive species on it, it's fine, but there's quite a risk there that if you've thrown your kit in the back of a car and it's damp, or you've got a boat that's got lots of contaminants on it, you might be a vector for spreading these invasive species. And the same's true for environment management and lots of other activities. This is some GIS modelling that Janet Richardson did with us as part of an ICAS project, where she looked at the spread of invasive species along river catchments in Yorkshire. And what you can see is reports of Japanese knotweed from 2014 through to 2017. And you can see a nice red arrow showing this, that the invasive species have progressed along the watercourse from 2014 to 2017. Clear evidence of spread. But I think what's the more interesting thing looking at that is if you look at the blue arrow and you see that the river goes the other way. So that spread can't be explained by natural movement of any fragments of plants along the river, but can only be explained by human activity. And actually further modelling that she did showed a close association with the presence of certain human activities, in particular things such as constructions or having lots of human activities such as footpaths running close to areas, which provided an opportunity for inadvertent movement of invasive species. So this is really just an illustration of how important human activity is in spreading INNS. But on the plus side, it's something we can do something about through biosecurity. The government's biosecurity campaign for freshwaters, which was launched back in about 2012 and has since been relaunched and is funded by a range of different water companies, is called Check, Clean and Dry. 3 simple actions to reduce the spread of invasive species. Check your gear after leaving the water, remove anything and leave it at the site. Clean everything as thoroughly as possible, again to remove stuff, and dry it all out. And that's because invasive species can actually live for quite a long time in damp conditions. Now, in fact, we did some work at the University of Leeds to explore the effectiveness of this check, clean, dry strategy. And what we found is that if you check, clean and dry your equipment over about 14, 16 days, then it's very, very effective. So these graphs show how many individuals are left alive for 7 different invasive species, 4 plants, 3 animals in different coloured bars. And you can see on the right-hand side, in our control, when we kept our invasive species, we've made a fake angler's keep net as it happened, but it could equally have been a welly or a piece of equipment used in management. In control conditions after 16 days, the vast majority of our invasive species were still alive. If the equipment had been hung up to dry in a nice warm aerated room, then after 16 days, most stuff was dead apart from a little bit of crassula. But after only 1 day, drying wasn't a very rapid way of killing things off. So we also had a look at trying to immerse things in hot water. And we find that immersing any equipment that can be immersed in hot water for 10 minutes, just tap hot water, 60 degrees, will kill the majority of invasive species off. So that's something that was introduced to the strategy for trying to slow the spread of invasive species. Check, clean, use hot water if you can, and try and dry stuff out to slow the spread of invasive species. That's because INNS can survive more than 2 weeks in the absence of any biosecurity. Soaking in hot water kills the majority of invasive species. We can also use disinfectants in a very targeted way against invasive diseases, things like plant diseases or fish diseases. But remember, they're not effective against plants and the majority of animals. So they're an addition, not an alternative biosecurity measure, but they're really important for dipping of nets and things to kill off invasive species. And then for large kit, we can try to physically remove things. Pressure sprayers are good at physically removing potential invasive species, so long as they go back into an area they initially came from. Because unfortunately, hot pressure washers only work if you've got a very small bit of equipment and a lot of time to spend doing it, because obviously the water cools down quite quickly. So one of the things that I particularly want to talk about today was a new e-learning package that we have managed to develop in collaboration with the Non-Native Species Secretariat. So the University of Leeds, the ICASP project, and the Non-Native Species Secretariat have been working together on developing an e-learning package aimed at biosecurity for universities, colleges, field, research centres, anybody doing anything out in the natural environment, anybody doing any research or environment management. And this is now located on the Non-Native Species Secretariat's website, where it's accessible for anybody who chooses to use it, and where it's located amongst other e-learning materials if anybody wants to find out more about invasive species or about particular targeted biosecurity. At this point, I'll try and have a look at that, Finn, if that's okay.